What happened in the gap between the Old and the New Testaments?
Is there a question that's bothering you? What should we do if we haven't a clue? Ask Tim!
There are about 400 years between the end of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New Testament. 400 years! That's a long wait. I get grumpy waiting about 2 minutes for the kettle to boil. So what was going on in these mysteriously missing 4 centuries? Well, we actually have quite a lot of information about what was going on with God's people at this time, but as it is not in most of our Bibles, let me fill in some of the gaps. I say this information is not in most of our Bibles because some Bibles, like this one, have a strange middle section called the apocrypha. These are books which were written between the time of the Old Testament and the New Testament. And Christians in some traditions consider them to be scripture, but for those of us who don't, they are still well worth a read. The apocrypha contains all sorts of fascinating bits and pieces. There are extra later additions to well-known biblical books like Esther, Jeremiah and Daniel. There are collections of wise thoughts which are similar to the biblical books of Proverbs and Ecclesiastes. Then there are some really entertaining stories, like the one about the heroine Judith who saved God's people by chopping off the head of the baddie Holofernes. Or Tobit, which tells the story of Tobit's son Tobias, as he is accompanied by the angel Raphael on his adventures. Think Pilgrim's Progress meets Lord of the Rings. But there are also some books which fill in the historical gap between the Old Testament and the New, most significantly the books of 1 and 2 Maccabees. When the Old Testament closes, God's people are mainly in exile under the authority of the ancient superpower of Persia, but the kings of Persia allow some of the Jews to return to their homeland to rebuild the city of Jerusalem and God's temple. But the Persian Empire is eventually defeated by the Macedonian king Alexander the Great, who is brilliant at invading places if less good at ruling them. He dies young and his empire is split up among his friends. The next century or so sees the descendants of these friends as rival rulers constantly at war with each other, and God's people find themselves right in the middle of the action. Eventually, one of these regional rulers goes too far, and the Jews rebel under the leadership of a remarkable family called the Maccabees. This family led many gruesome battles against armies and elephants, and eventually win independence for the Jewish people for the first time since the destruction of the kingdom of Judah 400 years earlier. This independent Jewish kingdom would last until the Romans came along in 63 BC. Now this is significant for us as Christians because it is the backdrop to Jesus' arrival. God's people were awaiting the Messiah, God's anointed king, who would come and do exactly what the Maccabees did, kick some Roman bottom. So when Jesus claimed to be the Messiah, the anointed king, that was exactly what people were expecting him to do. But Jesus turned out to be a very different kind of king, with a very different agenda. He was going to save people, all right, but it was not going to be in the way that anyone expected.
Is there a question that's bothering you? What should we do if we haven't a clue? Ask Tim!